Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Odessa Dwarika. I'm the Director of Programs and Services at the Mass Council on Gaming and Health. We're a private nonprofit agency and we strive to reduce the harms of video gaming and gambling so that people can enjoy these activities safely. Today we're going to be talking about veterans and gambling. And to help us with this conversation, I have with me Charlie Ordilli. He's my colleague at the Mass Council on Gaming and Health. And he is a game sense advisor out of Plain Ridge Park Casino. And I also have Kevin Budry. He's a licensed social worker and he works with the VA hospital in Bedford, and they're both veterans. So thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to start out with you, Charlie. Can you give us a little bit more information on statistics around veterans and problem gambling? How much of an issue is it?
Sure. Veterans are considered a high-risk population for developing a gambling problem. Studies have shown that veterans are twice as likely to develop a gambling problem than the general population. That number can increase to 1 in 3 veterans who are getting treated for post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Wow. What are some of the signs that gambling has become a problem for somebody?
Well, a few of the signs: preoccupation with gambling, the need to bet more just to get that same excitement from their gambling, repeated and failed attempts to either limit their gambling time or to quit altogether, restlessness or irritability when trying to cut back, gambling to escape those negative emotions or thoughts, lying about gambling, chasing losses, and then relying on bailouts for a financial crisis due to their gambling.
So when you say chasing your losses, what does that mean?
Well, chasing losses is where a person was just betting more money, just trying to get even. You know, we're running to the ATM machine to get more money, to get back in action, to try to win that money back.
Okay. Kevin, you're a licensed social worker. You're a veteran yourself. I would really love to hear a little bit more about your role in helping vets address addiction and why you think veterans are at an increased risk for gambling addiction in particular.
Yeah. My role at the VA right now, I'm a Veterans Justice Outreach Coordinator. So I'm working with veterans that are involved in the justice system and supporting them with referrals and things along those lines. And I've been in that job for a little while, but prior to that I worked in mental health, working in dual diagnosis. I think that there's two main reasons that veterans are at risk for gambling addiction and addictions in general. One is the culture of the military. The culture of the military is really one that kind of encourages this hard work, hard play. It's something where they have a long day and they're wanting to kind of unwind. And most service members have very few bills, so there's not really anything restraining them or any promised money for maybe going and paying for a house or anything along those lines. It's all supported in that. The other big reason is after leaving the military, many veterans have difficulty adjusting to the community. They may have developed trauma or wounds that they may avoid things, and they don't necessarily have the supports that are established in the community. And so a lot of them have difficulty being able to cope in the community. That work hard, play hard, and then the big thing I would kind of categorize the second half is avoidance, avoiding kind of the issues that are at hand.
So avoiding uncomfortable emotions and feelings.
Yep.
From being back. Okay. So you mentioned trauma, and we know that traumatic experiences really set up people to be more vulnerable to addiction, more vulnerable to gambling addiction in particular. Have you worked with clients who have some, gambling issues, and kind of how did they struggle with that? You know, what were some strategies that you used with them?
I've worked with veterans with a lot of different types of addictive behaviors. One of the common things that you see with addictive behaviors is that they're largely underreported or minimized. So people don't look at them as being an issue. Specifically with gambling, people won't talk about it, or they'll kind of say, oh, it's just a small thing. The other big thing is that they're co-occurring. They happen at the same time. So somebody might be dealing with gambling and also dealing with an addiction to alcohol or an addiction to drugs. And so they kind of steamroll into things until it becomes overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's an issue of debt of not being able to pay the money, and then also a debt of emotions that they've not been able to deal with. So looking at the mental health and then the addiction working together in this perfect storm.
Yeah, I know that being in early recovery from drugs and alcohol is a time that some people fall into gambling addiction. And I know that a lot of times clinicians don't even know to screen for it or look for the issue of gambling. Have you ever worked with a client where it came up and you were able to give them some support around that?
I think it's a very difficult thing because it gets back to the issue of people minimizing.
Yeah.
If I have an addiction to, let's say, heroin, it's looked at in the public as you have an addiction, right? You have an addiction, you need to deal with it. Whereas if it's an addiction to gambling, oh, I'm just spending this money, I'm just spending this, and it can be looked at as under control, whereas it might be something that's affecting them on a larger scale. One of the things that I think, it works towards this perfect roller coaster is because it gets back to that avoidance, which is one of the big things with trauma, people that are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the biggest issues that they have is avoidance. They're avoiding the things that become difficult, and they can lose themselves within gambling, lose themselves within drugs. And it's easier to sit there and say, I have a drug addiction, and go get treatment for it. Whereas there's not as many, they do exist, not as many treatments for gambling addiction. At the VA in Boston, they have a group that work with behavioral addictions, and likewise at Bedford where I work, they have a behavioral addictions clinic as well too. But I don't think that it's utilized as much as it's probably needed.
Right. I know that there's a lot of silence around it. A lot of therapists or clinicians and providers in general just aren't aware of it as an issue, and so sometimes it's missed a lot. And at the council, we're really concerned about the issue because we know that there are really high rates of suicidality, suicidal ideation with people who have a gambling addiction. So it's something that we're always trying to draw attention to. Charlie, my next question is for you. We talked about, I know you work in the casinos. What are some ways that game sense advisors who are in each of the casinos in Massachusetts, how can they be helpful for veterans who are coming in to gamble recreationally? They see a game sense advisor, like how can you guys interact with them in a way that's helpful?
Well, we, game sense advisors, they interact with any casino patrons, in ways to keep their gambling fun, keep it safe, healthy, and fun. We offer activities, to educate the public about how the games work, the odds of the different games, basically to answer any questions that maybe come about the different games. There's a lot of myths about casino gambling, and we try to dispel those myths. What we want people to know the facts before they play. Just know what they're getting into before they gamble, right? We encourage people to set limits, whether it be a budget, a time limit, a win limit. Win so much, let's leave, or the loss limit. I lost my $100, I'm going home.
Right.
We also provide responsible play information, like the risk associated with gambling, and while allowing the players to make their own educated decisions. But we have the tools for them. Some of the tips we offer is like, have a plan. Know how long you want to play before you play. Take breaks. Frequent break. Get up, clear your head, take a walk. Don't borrow money to gamble that you can't afford. To gamble with. Don't chase those losses, as we mentioned earlier, and then balance gambling with other fun leisure activities. It's not all about gambling. There's other things to do.
So I know there's a lot of myths around slot machines in particular. What are some myths that you know about?
Well, person's been playing this slot machine for an hour and they run out of money, they want to get more money. Don't let anybody play with it. It's going to hit. It's going to hit. each spin is random. It doesn't matter. Everything is random. So not
So
necessarily.
the longer you stay there, it does not increase your chances of winning.
That is correct.
Okay.
We also have a program called Play My Way. It's available right now. It's only available at Plainridge Park Casino. It's for slot players. It's coming soon to MGM Springfield and Encore Boston Harbor, but it's a voluntary budgeting tool. The guest can set a budget, whether it be daily, weekly, or monthly, and then alerts would pop up on their slot machine that they're playing when they're approaching their budget. I always tell people it's a good opportunity to take that break, because you sit down at a game at a casino, your money goes quick. There's no clocks in a casino. You don't know what time it is, and your budget comes up 50%. Maybe it's time to take a walk.
Right.
Take a little break. And then we also have a lot of other helpful resources. One is the Voluntary Self-Exclusion Program. We also have access to Gamblers Anonymous, Gam-Anon for families of gamblers, Smart Recovery. We have access to certified clinicians that specialize in gambling. We have a recovery liaison with the Mass Council. And then we also have financial and legal resources that we share with the guests.
So you mentioned voluntary self-exclusion. So I know that this can be an important tool for somebody who's feeling like they're not able to manage their casino gambling well. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So if a person feels that their gambling is a problem or can become a problem, the Mass Gaming Commission has a program. It's called the Voluntary Self-Exclusion Program. A person can self-exclude from the 3 casinos in Massachusetts for a term of 1, 3, or 5 years. If they complete one of those terms and they would like to have a lifetime restriction, we can assist them with that as well. Once a person is on the voluntary self-exclusion list, they do not come off until the end of their term, and they must meet with a GameSense advisor for a reinstatement session. And at that reinstatement session, what we do is we talk to them, we offer them any other resources that they may need, and just see how the program has helped them. And the VSEs, they can be done whether at one of the 3 GameSense information centers or at the Mass Gaming Commission's headquarters in Boston, or we now do them remotely by going to by using the GameSense Safer Gaming Education line.
So it's interesting. So if I'm a person and I feel like I'm not managing my casino gambling, I decide to self-exclude, I walk back into Encore Boston Harbor, let's say, and start gambling. My understanding is then I would not be able to keep any winnings that I had. Is that correct?
That is correct. Unfortunately, sometimes people, have that urge,
Yeah.
and they violate their restrictions.
Yeah.
And if they get detected, they are asked to leave the gaming facility. Yes, they cannot collect the jackpot if they hit, and any money that they put into the machines or the tables, they must forfeit.
Well, that's a pretty good deterrent.
Yes, it is.
Going back to you, Kevin, you were talking about aspects of military culture that might put veterans at elevated risk for gambling. Can you just talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I'll use my example of being in the military. So I returned from Iraq in 2004, and a lot of veterans after returning from being out in the Middle East or wherever from deployments, they come back with full bank accounts. And this doesn't just have to be if you've deployed. If you're going into any training, you're coming back and you got a full bank account. And within months, you would see, after my deployment and other deployments, you'd see that people had new cars, they'd have new things that were there, they'd go on trips, they'd have all sorts of unsustainable purchases that they would make. It's like being a lottery winner. They end up with all sorts of debts, and then later on they're not able to sustain or not able to do things. And additionally, with that culture that I mentioned before, the work hard, play culture, it results in this culture of people that want to go out and do things that give them a lot of relaxation when they're done. So what is there around every military base? You'll find places where people can gamble, strip clubs, and bars. Every single base. They do well in their businesses. and they can't restrict them when they're in the military. So it's something that is accepted a lot of times within military culture in itself, resulting in that big issue. That avoidance is also a big thing. It masks the deeper issues that people might have in being able to deal with the stress of my boss yelled at me, or somebody passed away when I was in the military, or things along those lines. Getting back to that emotional debt. So it really hits those two things that I talked about before, which is kind of like a culture that almost encourages addictions, and then two, having this isolation when you leave, to where I don't necessarily know how to deal with things. I don't know how to budget. I don't understand money, and it can result in a lot of people having issues with gambling.
Okay. So what are some ways that we could better support veterans so that they're less likely to develop a gambling disorder?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for veterans and the culture that we have, we have a lot of, it's 2021 now, and we've had 20 years of being at war, and just had the end of Afghanistan recently, which has caused a lot of stress. What can be the biggest help for everything that's going on is knowing the resources that are available, knowing that the VA has, a phone number you can call if you're in crisis. So like if you're having suicidal thoughts, or, maybe you're just not able to cope in the moment, there's the crisis line, 800-273-8255, and press 1. You can call that. That's a huge thing. But then also knowing that you can seek out more support. The VA in itself, you can apply for benefits, see if you can get support, those mental health groups and things along those lines that are there. And even if you can't meet the requirements for the VA, knowing that just taking those steps can result in getting referrals and support in different areas and stuff for people. So I think that that's the biggest thing, is just knowing what's out there for veterans, knowing who you can call. And within Massachusetts, we actually have VSOs, Veteran Service Officers, that are in every single city that know all those resources. And so you can reach out to them and say, hey, my brother, my partner, whoever it is, my sister, they can call them up and say, hey, this person is needing help. And you can kind of get a list of resources that are available within the state as well, too.
So it's a culture where you really need to be strong, you need to be tough, but then at the same time, you don't need to suffer in silence afterwards. I mean, so many people are struggling with addictions of all kinds. But I know in Massachusetts, the statistics are shaking out. It looks like about 8% are gambling in a risky way, and 2% probably meet the criteria for gambling disorder or gambling addiction. So you're talking about 1 in 10 people in Massachusetts having risky gambling or disordered gambling. So this is something that so many people are struggling with, so many families are struggling with. And there's no reason to feel ashamed or be silent about it. And so I think that's one of the messages today. If you are a casino gambler, you like to go to the casinos, you're feeling a little like you're not managing that gambling really well, we have, game sense advisors like Charlie in every casino in Massachusetts. They wear green game sense shirts. They're there to talk to you all day, every day at Encore Boston Harbor. They're there 24 hours a day. And there's also so many resources at the Veterans Administration as well. But the thing about Massachusetts, for people who live in Massachusetts, is what we don't realize is we have some of the highest gambling rates in the entire country. We have the most profitable lottery in the United States. We have the second most profitable lottery in the world. This means that on average, each adult resident of Massachusetts is spending about $1,100 a year on the lottery. But we know that's not really the case. Maybe I didn't spend any, and maybe you spent $20,000 on the lottery. And we know, based on lottery sales, that a lot of these purchases per capita are coming out of the communities that are disproportionately poor and economically disadvantaged. We have 3 resort-style casinos in Massachusetts. And bordering Massachusetts, we have a casino in Rhode Island, and we have the casinos in Connecticut. So there are just more opportunities to gamble here than in some other states. Everywhere you go to buy gas, you walk into a convenience store to buy a drink, you're going to get faced with the lottery. And we have sports betting that will probably be passed, legalized sports betting in Massachusetts within the next year. We have folks doing fantasy sports, sports betting like at work, doing pools, So I think if somebody does have that issue of feeling kind of dysregulated, feeling like there's a history of trauma, feeling like there's uncomfortable emotions, who might not use alcohol or might not pick up drugs, gambling is an issue. It's so socially acceptable. It's so easily available that you can begin gambling and not even realize that it's leading you down a path of addiction just because it seems like everybody's doing it.
Sounds very similar to the way that tobacco was viewed back in the 1980s, where everyone was doing it, it was everywhere, and people just developed addictions that had lasting influences on them.
Yeah.
And people can, not only the lottery, but the online gambling now during the pandemic, where they were locked in their homes and they're gambling online, whether it be legal or illegal.
Yeah.
It's just readily available.
Yeah. And it's tough because, 90% of the population or more can do it, and it's just a fun recreational activity. And if somebody who has a gambling problem, they might feel that shame or that stigma, like, hey, everybody else is gambling, they're not having a problem with it, but I'm struggling. Mm-hmm. And looking at that at-risk gambling, so maybe a person hasn't developed an addiction, but they're doing things like spending more money than they should. They're not able to make the rent that month because they've just spent too much. Going to poker night at their buddy's house every Friday, or they're lying from their spouse. When you say, oh, yeah, I didn't lose that much money, when you really lost that much money. Those are the little red flags and the little warning signs that people need to be kind of cautious of.
And for veterans specifically, in looking at how risks that they take in the civilian world after they've left the military can result in bigger issues. And then you feel like you need to take another risk to be able to break even, and another and another and another. It kind of plays on hope, which is kind of a weird thing to play on, but it doesn't.
I mean, that's the thing about gambling that's different from other kinds of addictions. If you drink alcohol and you pass out, you don't wake up the next day and think alcohol is going to solve my problems. But the reality is with gambling, it's intermittent reward. You might hit that jackpot. And so even though your chances are low, it's not completely irrational, right? There is a chance you can win, and that's what keeps you holding on. I mean, there's some statistics out there about families who are poor thinking about that playing the lottery is the best chance they have to pay for a college education for their child. And it might seem crazy to some people, but if you are truly poor and truly economically marginalized and can't see a way out of that, that lottery ticket does seem like your next best hope. So that intermittent reward, I think, is what is one of the most challenging things I think about treating and addressing the issue. And another complicating factor that I think is a little bit different than other addictions is this issue of bailout, right? You have somebody who's gone in a lot of debt. They go to their mother, let's say, Mom, you got to get me out of this situation. I borrowed all this money. I'm in a lot of trouble. Mom bails out young adult son, let's say, and then that person now is going to start using the money to gamble again. So sometimes you want to help somebody by bailing them out of their debt, but that's just giving them another way to start gambling again. So it gets really tricky as well when you look at the bailout issue.
It's very similar with people with addictions as well too. Hey, if you send me to this, other addictions, if you send me to this treatment center, I'll do okay. Might mortgage a house to be able to do something. Might do whatever you can to be able to make it so the person can get help because you see the desperation. But then it just results in further and further and further and further to the point where I like to think about emotional debt. Same with, physical debt. Emotionally, how can we make this relationship okay? It's near impossible when they've been hurt that much. Likewise with debt from gambling or debt from other things. When you've lost so much, how can we make it okay? Plays on that desire and the hope that something can change if you strike it big.
Right. And I think people really need their families for support when they're struggling with an addiction. But what happens is, I think with gambling, sometimes so many bridges get burned in the borrowing money that they can wind up in a place where they feel like they don't have the support from their family and friends anymore, and then it gets really tough to kind of get out of that because of that isolation and shame.
Yeah, sometimes that bailout is just a short-term fix because they'll bail them out of that situation, and then they create another situation with their gambling if they don't get their gambling corrected.
Yeah. What else is there, before we wrap up, is there anything else that kind of is important to say about this topic?
I think the biggest thing is just understanding that, like I said before, a lot of things are co-occurring. So if somebody's dealing with gambling addiction, they're likely dealing with something else as well too, whether it's depression or PTSD or just unresolved issues that are there. And so sometimes we see things that kind of give us signs that something deeper is going on. And that's a good chance to be able to say, hey, maybe you could get some more help. Call the crisis line. Do it with them. You can get a lot of help for people just by taking a step and saying, hey, I think something might be going on. And one of the good things about like the crisis line, which I mentioned earlier, is that they actually link it to the VA. So somebody's supposed to call you if you end up calling there and follow through with it and get you the help that you need.
Okay. And I know there's a lot of different kinds of gambling. There's not just casino, there's lottery, there's sports betting, there's, betting at the racetracks, there's off-track betting. But Charlie, I know you see a lot of folks who are in the casinos regularly. Have you seen a time where a person was struggling and they used some of the resources or a voluntary self-exclusion to kind of like get help?
Oh, absolutely. People come to us and with that reason, they know they have a problem. You can't tell them they have a problem, but they know. And they'll come to us and, I've done VSEs. There was a person, for instance, he was telling me about his very close friend that he believed had a gambling problem. Make a long story short, 2 weeks later, he came to me and said, Charlie, I was talking about myself. And he came in and he voluntarily self-excluded. He got the resources, and I had a couple conversations with him after the fact where he called the center, and he's doing very well. And he's not gambling anymore. He got his life back in order. But it's a big step for a person to take to admit they have that problem.
Kevin and Charlie, I really appreciate everything that you shared today. I really hope that at least one person who watched this thinks, oh my gosh, I feel like there's some help out there for me or for a loved one. Nobody needs to suffer in silence. There are people who understand, and there is help out there. So thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.